everybody. Welcome back to Desis Dragons. Today is another episode of Cast Friendship, and I have an extremely special guest with me today. You probably know about Wander Home if you're a part of the Desis Dragons, so we will not shut up about it. Today, I have with me um, Jade Dragon. Jay is the prolific writer designer behind Wander Home, Sleepaway, and the upcoming Yaziba's Bed and Breakfast. Jay is also the creative director and head publisher at Possum Creek Games. Before we jump into the conversation, Jay, would you like to give us an introduction?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. As Johnny wonderfully put it, I make a lot of things. I am the co-founder of Possum Creek Games, one of the writers for Uzaba's Bed and Breakfast. You probably know me from Wander Home. Most people seem to. Um, yeah, I'm a queer disabled game designer in the Hudson Valley in New York, which is in like the rural part, right? Like once you drive out of the city and you just go deep into the mountains, up there. And I just make lots of games about community and queerness and marginality and the magic of the mundane.
It's amazing. You say that you're from Hudson Valley. My first introduction to Hudson Valley was Spider Man Into the Spider Verse, where they talk about heading to the Hudson Valley and they have to take a bus there.
Yeah.
And
I when that came up in the movie, I like pointed and screamed because it felt so much like that like SpongeBob picture where like SpongeBob is pointing in the corner and he's like I'm over there because it's such a small shout out and the trees look nothing like trees in the Hudson Valley, right? But secret lab base doing weird experiments, very Hudson Valley. Like the idea of it really nailed the area. Like Doctor Octopus is absolutely building something kind of messed up in the woods, you know?
I love that. I hope to be able to visit someday. And it sounds like an incredible place. Is that also the inspiration for the name
It's
of Possum Creek?
uh yes. So Possum Creek is named after the creek that runs outside my house. I can't really get I can't tilt the camera to show you, but it's like over there. It's this beautiful big creek. Sort of a river. It's technically a creek, but like by all rights it's a river. Um, Hudson Valley is an area with like a lot of like old mountains, a lot of deep rivers, and a lot of like weird kind of magic and like mystery hidden in the corners. All of my games, like Ruby, my business partner for Possum Creek, she's also from the Hudson Valley, and the co-creator for Usabus is also from the Hudson Valley. So there's a lot of like shared visual language and shared conceptual language throughout basically everything Possum Creek does that ends up in one form or another referencing this kind of like mythical childhood space that we're all from.
That's amazing. It sounds incredible.
Mm-hmm.
But while we're on the topic
It's a beautiful place.
of
Mm-hmm.
the Hudson Valley, I'm gonna take us all the way back to the beginning. You've mentioned before that you got into role playing through the Wayfinder experience, LARP or live
Mm-hmm.
action role playing company. Just the concept of it is so surreal and otherworldly to me, like a kid who lived in the outskirts of
Mm-hmm.
Mumbai. The extent of like nerd culture where I
Mm-hmm.
grew up was like watching reruns of Ultimate Spider-Man on
Mm-hmm.
Disney XD or something. So
Mm-hmm.
walk me
Mm-hmm.
through your journey. What was it like getting
So
started at Wayfinder and then running LARPs for like over 100 people?
yeah, yeah. Wow, you've done your research. That's so exciting. It's so thrilling to be interviewed by someone who's clearly already covered the baselines, which is great. But so I got started LARPing, as you said, Wayfinder. Um, I started when I was 12 and I was running these large scale LARP productions by the time I was 14. It's basically a summer camp where like the whole structure of the camp is about building towards this like shared LARP experience. It has a weird history because it doesn't branch. So the Hudson Valley is where Woodstock happened, and the hippie culture is like very deep set. A lot of that like tie dye everywhere kind of energy to the place. And Wayfinder came out of an alternative healing institute that like one of its side things ended up yes I know one of its side things ended up being a LARP program, and then the LARP program exploded, and then they were like, hey, we don't really want to be a part of this weird healing institute anymore. We're going to go off and be our own thing. So it's got a very divergent evolution from basically the rest, and like exists in its own little bubble from basically the rest of like certainly like academic theory, but also like game culture. Um, a lot of it, and like you can see its influence in places, right? Brennan Lee Mulligan from Dimension 20 is also a Wayfinder alumnus, and his like both his style of DMing heavily as a very prolific game writer that like I grew up playing his games. He taught me a lot about what it's like to role play. A lot of his game style informed that culture of LARP, but also that kind of culture of being really present when playing informed kind of the way he runs stuff. So if you watch Dimension 20, it's very informed by that same approach. And for me, it was like I still think of games very experientially. I'm still kind of thinking about games as like how are people playing them in a physical or digital space. It took me a little bit when I finally played a tabletop game when I was like 19 or 18, to like get on board with the fact that they were valid games also, right? Like I kind of had a little bit of snobbishness at first where I was like, you're just sitting around a table. That's not a game. A game you gotta be running around doing things, which always makes me laugh when I see tabletop purists applying that same judgment to my games, because I finally started writing games. I started experimenting writing games in 2018, and I put something up online, and I got a Reddit comment being like, "This isn't a game. This is, it's something else. It's not a game though." And that the spite of that got me to start writing games.
It's
Just
a
the
good
desire to
fuel.
prove them wrong. Hmm.
um,
And
is
so my first published game was Sleepaway in 2019, about a cursed summer camp. Um, who's to say where that came from? And then Wander Home Kickstarter in 2020. That was kind of my big breakout hit. And then Uzaba's is currently crowdfunding right now on Indiegogo. So that's my abbreviated life story.
I love that. I am so excited to get my hands on the book. I kicked out. I keep saying Kickstarter because I'm so. It's become like
I
the
do that too. It
colloquial
took me
word.
so long.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Indiegogo.
It's like Xeroxing, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so excited. I
Mm-hmm.
got the Night Porter edition so I can play with my friends in person and everything. I'm super hyped for it. But
Mm-hmm.
I wanna
Mm-hmm.
talk. You mentioned Ruby. Ruby Lavin is the art director at Possum
Yes.
Creek Games. In one of your
Mm-hmm.
interviews together, she mentioned that everything that you write ends up being a role playing game. And you followed up with the example that you wrote a LARP about Notre Dame and the Purgatory for an art history class. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah,
How do
yeah.
you create, like, what's your thought process when it comes to creating these games, and how do they usually end up being RPGs?
So my games are, I think like for me, writing games is like my language for self-articulation, and the way other people's might be like poetry or art. It's like for me, there's something about not just kind of presenting the world I see it, but inviting you to see it too, that is very kind of fundamental to me. And it's almost inescapable, right? Like when I think about I'm trying to learn how to write novels. I'm trying to learn how to kind of expand my writing skills because I'm always a student or whatever. And it's hard because it's so much harder to be like I'm gonna sit here and monologue for 70,000 words as opposed to like I'm gonna take you with me into this world. Like I'm gonna give a little bit, you're gonna give a little bit. There's gonna be this thing between us that, and like that's is how books work too, right? Like books have that same philosophy, but it's more subtle. It's more, it's a little it's a little like it's more it's harder to articulate.
Mm.
Whereas like for games, it's very apparent. Where it's like what a game gets to be is that I get to take you into this other space and show you this other space, and you get to show me something in return.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the appeal of LARPs is like the very embodied nature of it, and like the very like I get to like every time I experience something, there's a little mechanism in the back of my head that's figuring out like what are the systems here? How would I represent this? How could I represent this in writing? And with LARP, it's very natural because it's all very embodied. For tabletop, it's more abstract. But tabletop, you're able to give it to other people, right? I'm able to write something and share it with you, and then you can do it with other folks, and I don't have to be there. So it's almost like I get to kind of conceptualize this mechanism and then distribute it.
Mm.
And even if it's not necessarily like quite as magical as like bringing you into the woods at night and showing you the fireflies, I'm still able to bring you. I'm still able to give you something for you to play with, and you're able to give me something for me to play with.
I think there's a big sense of community in that regard when it comes to role playing games, right? You've created something and now it's
Mm-hmm.
larger than you as a person. It's so many people, right? Everybody's version of
Mm-hmm.
your
Mm-hmm.
story. And
Yeah,
Yazeba's
absolutely.
bed and breakfast, it almost feels like a celebration of life, right? Like it urged me to here's my copy, my ashcan that I
Yes.
even bound.
Wonderful.
Um,
That was smart. Do I have my copy around? I have a big purple binder that I don't think I have near me, but it's this big purple binder that has my copy of the game in it. Yeah.
that's amazing. Uh, y- I was gonna say that it sort of urged me to pause and appreciate the joy and the sadness and the ups and downs of life in a way.
Mhm.
And you just
Mhm.
mentioned how you sort of look at things and wonder how you can turn that into a bit of a mechanic. So as a designer, how do
Mhm.
you gamify life, like this really vast, immense experience? What are the considerations you have to take?
Yeah. I think for Uzabas, one of the big things we talked about is that kind of ultimately, as it's come together, it's clear that what it is a game about community, right? In this kind
Mm,
of broad scale sense. And I always come back to the ship of Theseus, where
mm,
it's like you have this ship that is a community, right? You have a community of people. And 50 years later, you've replaced every single plank and board of that ship with a new plank and board, right? Every single member of the community has come and gone. You've mourned their deaths. You've celebrated their future endeavors. They've one way or another moved on from the space, and new people have come in and filled it. But it's still the same community. The structure is still present, and what Yazeba's I think aims to be about is very much the idea of what does it mean to represent a community, and also kind of in this multifold ship of Theseus process where we have built a community that we give to you, right? The start of Yazeba's is a very it's there it feels, I think, for people who are very kind of used to games that are very freeform, it feels a little restrictive. But the trick of it is that the more you play, the more you replace each plank of wood with a plank of wood of your own devising, you expand it, you evolve it, and ultimately the end goal of Yazeba's is an object which has no connection to where it was at the beginning, right? It has become something totally new, but it's still Yazeba's bed and breakfast. It's still the community, that kind of continuation. And yeah, how do you mechanize life? That's that's the question, isn't it? Um, the big trick I think we ended up having to do for Yusevas was that the um the rules aren't the center of the game,
mm,
right?
yeah.
The rules are very modular. Each chapter provides a different set of rules. Um, and so that's kind of our trick, right? Is that it's infinite in what more rules you can add to it. It's infinite in its expansion because it is seeking, in a sense, to represent life or a version of life. And if you want to, like, if you want to add to it, it's very easy, right? But yeah, I think that like the core of it, the trick of it is that most games put their mechanics at their core, and Uzaba's put something else at its core.
Right.
You know.
I think that's wonderful. I've read through like start to finish of the Ashcan, and I feel what you're saying in the pages that I can read so far. So I think you've done a wonderful job at sort of putting that
The
to
team the
paper.
team really killed that.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked about community a little bit, and that makes me think of the Indian TTRPG community. It's still very young. Like tabletop role playing hasn't
Mm-hmm.
really blown up here the way it has in Western countries. What's interesting to
Mm-hmm.
me though is that a lot of people who do end up getting into TTRPGs here are often they start off with D&D 5e, but they're also often drawn to games beyond that. And an example of that is the Desis Dragons Discord server. We have like a very dedicated
Mm-hmm.
Wander Home group,
Mm-hmm.
and we often introduce newcomers to TTRPGs with Wander Home and similar games. And I think there's something incredibly unique about this sort of community focused game that you've created. And it makes me feel like people from all walks of life can find themselves in it. And I assume this is an intentional choice considering you're also queer and you're disabled, and I
Mm-hmm.
just want to know how you approach inclusivity in your games?
Yeah. So I always really love a friend of mine, Kazumi, who's also the editor for both Wanderhome and Uzaba's. Kazumi talks a lot about this idea that um, diversity is inclusion, right? These are first steps,
Hmm.
and that we can understand, and like we talk about this in terms of like safety is a first step, right? Like all of these kind of very core principles that come up a lot when people talk about RPGs are effectively the first steps.
Right.
And so the trick is to make a game, right? Like you can make a game that has safety tools, and that game is safe, but it doesn't go beyond being safe, right? You can have a game that is safe and inclusive, but what does it mean to go next from there? And so the thing that Kazumi and I talk about is like you want to make a game where people feel safe, they feel included, they feel like they belong. Like not only are there people like them, kind of like there's space in this world, but like there's a space which asks them to be there. They belong in the circle. Um, and then finally that they have the agency to change and reshape the circle.
Hmm.
And all of that, I think, on a structural level. And then finally, I think that a big thing that I'm always looking at is who's not at the table, right? Which is a really common refrain, especially in like a lot of like incredible marginalized creators have talked about the concept of who is not at the table.
Hmm.
And to me, a lot of that is like when you have a philosophy around play, when you have an approach to play, any approach to play is not going to be universal. It's not going to accommodate all forms of play. So who is not who what space is left, right? Like what is missing from this environment? And so what I'm trying to do is try to expand kind of what is the play space, and specifically expand expand the game's understanding of play a few steps wider than I can envision. Right? Like I want games that ultimately there are ways to play Wanderhome that I couldn't have imagined. Right? Like I want people to pick up Wanderhome and play it better and different and fuller than I could have, because I understand my positional elimination, like my the privileges that mean I can't see the structure, I can't see the ways of play that I'm letting out, and so the trick is to build something that kind of implicitly and explicitly leaves that space for those other designs.
Right.
That someone can come in with their own approach and philosophy and do something more than I could have envisioned or seen.
Have you seen this ever, like in action, where you ever heard about somebody's experience of playing, say, Uzaba or Wanderhome, and been like, that's
Mm-hmm.
not something I thought of, or that's not something I accounted for in my writing?
I think there's been a few. I'm thinking it through. So right off the bat, there's a lot of ways I did imagine, and there's been a lot of that like kind of fulfillment that most I think game designers would dismiss outright. So I did anticipate. I think there are things I've learned to anticipate. So I know for Sleepaway,
Hmm.
there was a lot of fan fiction written about Sleepaway, and people would go on TikTok and dress up as their Sleepaway camp counselor and do TikToks as their Sleepaway camp counselor. And I wasn't prepared for that model of play at all. I was not in any way thinking that that was a form of play. And now at this point, when people write Uzaba's fan fiction, when people make Uzaba's fan art, there's not the same like there's not the same like
Yeah.
head explosion. It's still very exciting and wonderful, but it doesn't shock me in the same way because I've learned that that's part of play. I think there are some ways people play Wanderhome that surprise me. I think there are like worlds that people build, like versions of the Haith people build that were not kind of within my conception.
Right.
Not that that's a bad thing. I just didn't. It was not how I imagined it, and people have gone much further. I think it takes people. I think it'll take people some time. I think to truly surprise me with Yaseba's, but I know it's popular. I know it's possible. I know that they're easily. I think I've already seen people like, or started to realize ways people can approach it that feel more than what I anticipated. Um, but I think that learning. I think for me, yeah, Sleepaway fan culture. That moment was like when realizing that a model of play that I didn't design for was the act of fan consumption and creation, right? That
Right.
the fandom relationship with the Tumblr fandom relationship with artistic creation, which is a very different one than the TRPG player relationship.
Right. And that's awesome. I mean, I can only imagine what it's like to see something you've created and then like watch people in real time take it and run with it to this completely new degree.
It feels very exciting. It's very strange. It's yeah, it's a little like I toil away in my little cave, my little, I sit in my little hut and I write my little games, and then people take them and they do incredible things with them that I couldn't have anticipated. And like that's just every stage of the process, like from getting art back from artists to like seeing people play it. So
This actually makes me think of the Hate Grant, which is for our viewers, the stretch goal at 400,000 USD at the Uzaba's Bed and Breakfast Indiegogo. Um, Possum Creek would launch the Hate Grant, and I think it's a wonderful thing to do. I really hope that the Indiegogo reaches that point. And it really rings true to that importance of community, a theme which obviously plays in your games as well. Like a member of the Desis community, you spoke with them a little bit. Ari already has plans for like creating stuff for Uzaba, and someone else has made a playbook for Wanderhome. So it just feels really nice to see thought being given to creators and their ability to add to what you've created. Was this experience with, say, for example, Sleepaway and all the fan content that came out of it, did that influence this decision?
oh yeah, absolutely. I think once I kind of understood like fan spaces, creating a fan community, creating a culture around your work, right? As you grow in size is kind of an inevitable process of creation, like micro celebrity or whatever you want to call it, whatever. But I think that I have a moral obligation to create a community that cares, right? I've kind of a moral obligation to help guide people towards being a compassionate community. And also, it's important to me that it's a very creator focused community, right? Like, I think that um, like an RPG doesn't stand alone. It can't. It has to, be kind of surrounded by the culture of play around it. I love the Hate Grant because it's almost like the reverse of how a lot of crowdfunding projects handle uh like creating extra content, right? Where it's like you'll either like you'll hire six of your friends to each write a playbook, and it's so much better to just instead be like, just I'm gonna give this money out to just all sorts of people, and they're gonna make things that I didn't expect to be made. With the Wanderhome Haith Grant, someone made bottles of wine. They made like a special Wanderhome like liquor, and I was just like, yeah, I wasn't anticipating that. There was no world in which I could have said, go forth and make Wanderhome liquor, but that would never have been a stretch goal that crossed my mind. But someone came to us and was like, I have this proposal. Will you help me do it? And it's like, yes. um, and yeah, like the Hate Kind, I love that for that reason. I think that like I want to foster a very creator oriented community. I want to foster a space for game design and creative work as like an emergent process. I've been thinking a lot about like how to kind of give give to future generations of game designers and give to my peers and like create kind of tools for that. It's a work in progress. I've got kind of vague sketches, but I do think it's important that I don't want to be um I don't want to just put my stuff out there, right? I want to make sure that other people have the space to put their own stuff out there as well.
That's amazing, and I think if 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 this sort of culture of helping each other create catches on, I think that will usher like a whole new generation of writer designers into the space. Um,
I really hope so. I mean, RPGs are on the verge of they're gaining a lot of traction, and also like there are no good inroads right now in terms of becoming a game designer. If you want to be a one-person workshop, especially if you're in the global north, there like you can kickstart your heart's content and build up a tiny little studio and make like enough money to like live at the poverty line with. That's not sustainable, and it's also like that's not actually a way to get more voices out there. That is a publishing model which benefits a handful of people, and like it benefits people who live in the global north who can access Kickstarter and also who can like afford to put all that work into, or who are either like have this is a side hustle for them, or they're so desperate that this is the only vision surviving. And there needs to be other avenues, right? There needs to be like small publishers who take on other people's work. It needs to be like an accepted part of the culture that you can be someone who writes and who just writes and who isn't also having to do all the other parts of creative work
Right.
of running a publishing house,
Right.
in addition to being a writer.
Which you do. So let's talk about that for a moment
Which I
because
do.
you're a
Which I
writer,
do.
designer, and you also run your own publishing house, which is Possum Creek Games. That's a lot of jobs
Hmm.
for one person to tackle.
It's a lot of jobs. I've been over the past couple of years. Basically, Wanderhome blew up. We
Yeah.
got like, we're working on it, and I was like, oh, this is not a sustainable model for me to continue to work. So I've spent the past couple of years basically trying to figure out how do I make Possum Creek a sustainable process for me where
Right.
I'm not burning myself operating it. And I haven't found the exact trick yet, but it is an important part where it's like I want to get to the point where my day job is publishing, is operating the publishing house.
Right.
And my creative and design work is off to the side. That's like a side hobby
Right.
that I do for fun because I don't want to be a writer professionally. I don't want to be like a full-time creator. That is hard and exhausting and strict deadlines and like I have to write or else, a dozen people won't be able to afford rent. That's a horrible spot to be in. That's the least creative space I can imagine being in. So my priority is like I want to ultimately be a publisher who's putting out other people's work
Right.
because that doesn't put the onus on me to be the generator of ideas, and instead lets me kind of handpick the people who can bring something new. And it just, lets me, I can still get to do some writing and still get that out there when I have a chance.
Right. But while you're getting to that point, what does self care look like for you?
Um, so lately a lot of so it what a hard question actually.
Sorry.
Because for the past few months, right, it's been Indiegogo time. It's been this kind of um having like I was joking with a friend where it's like when you are self-employed, you think of yourself as like, oh, I get to set my own hours, and it's like, no, no, no. At first, you have no hours. At first, you have every hour, right? Like you are on the clock 24/7, seven. Like you are destroying yourself, and your goal as a self-employed person is to get to the point where you're setting your own hours consistently. But what I've been trying to do is I don't work on weekends. I do 9 to 5s. I only answer emails during the day. I've been trying to have a separate. I go to my mom's house to work because she lives like 30 minutes away. So I drive over to her house, and then clitter clatter for 7 hours, and then I drive back home, and that kind of gives me the emotional distance from
Right.
my work, where it feels less like my job is just kind of in the air at all times, and rather that I'm doing that. And I've been playing a lot of. I've been listening to a podcast about Homestuck, which
Okay.
is very nostalgic for me because I read that when I was a teenager. And I've been like playing various video games that are just kind of like ways to turn my brain off and just go into full strategy mode, like chess, right? Where I'm just like, I'm not gonna, just gonna try and turn my brain off and enter into this other space that is doesn't require kind of creative work.
That's that's great to hear. The reason I asked is because like for me, I have two day jobs and I run this community and I like have my own business and I'm like I need to hear from other people who are doing a lot of things how they sustain it. But good to know. Um
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah, I've found that just making sure there is some time when you're not working, like designating time.
yeah.
I have a planner now. I didn't have it for a little bit, but having a planner is nice because it lets me draw in like lets me visualize like I learned a bit of advice on to-do lists that helped me a lot, which was that like the point of a to-do list is not to make sure you get everything done. It's so you can strategically decide what not to do.
Right.
Like the to-do list exists to eliminate stuff from, and I really like that. And that's how I think about my planner too, where it's like I look at the stuff I've got scheduled for a day, and I'm able to be like, oh, I've double booked myself, or I can be like, I am not doing
Right.
that. Or like I need to change it because I messed this up. That kind of like just having the schedule, or it's like I need like I can't do 3 back-to-back meetings. I can see that visually. I thought I could, but in practice, I know I can't. So let's put a break in there in the middle.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think me and a lot of the people who might watch this have a thing or two to learn from that. So thank you. Let's
It's
jump.
so hard. We live in a society of overwork.
Let's jump to Uzabas again. And
Mhm.
I hesitate to call the game wholesome because I feel like the word wholesome often writes something off as like too twee or too cute or lacking depth. But there is a
Yeah.
certain serenity to Usaba's bed and breakfast and Wander Home as well. It almost like urges people to choose hope and kindness. And what draws you towards creating games like this?
So when I first started writing, I was a horror writer, and I wrote a
Yeah.
lot of horror. And I wrote some really dark, kind of miserable stuff around like bodies and suffering and death and kind of this queer pessimism that I fell very into, which was like, it is the nature of queerness to destroy heritage. Like you have nothing but a spark in the darkness, and you will, die unknown. And I was like, okay, cool. This is what will get me through college artistically. And I just got to a point where I was too sad to believe in the bad stuff. Like, I think people, part of the reason I'm resistant to wholesome, right, is that it's a little frustrating, right, to be a predominantly, like queer, predominantly femme publishing company and for everyone to be like, the cutesy shit, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse.
You're
But,
free to curse like a
um,
sailor. It's all good.
okay, that's good. So yeah, the cutesy shit. But, also, like, anything I write that's hopeful, right, like Wanderhome and Yazeba's both, come from like a place of like deep despondence and like deep
Right.
kind of like like why do you write about lighthouses, right, when you're near rocks? You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like it's a desire to create something that is beautiful, because it is hard to hold that beauty internally. And I need a place to externalize that and to be able to look at it and be like, I created this. It has a lot to teach me. Um, and yeah, so I think that the games are about, I think Yuseba's, even though I'm not the only one working on it, I think that collaborative, I think first off, certainly it is, communal artistic work has an impact on each person who makes it in their own way. Um, Yoseba's, I think, had a very major emotional impact on me just in terms of like it is a game about community when I needed community. It is a game about being together with people that we predominantly wrote during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Um, it is a game about like growing old over the passage of time in a context where it's really hard to conceptualize that that's possible. And so I think oftentimes people mistake. I put it pretty well a little bit ago, but it was like oftentimes people mistake like stories about lights in the darkness as being stories that claim that the darkness does not exist.
Hmm.
But a story about light and the darkness must in some way acknowledge that darkness does
Yeah.
exist. It's just not the center point of the story. The purpose of the story is the light.
Yeah.
But you can't tell a story about light without knowing that there is a part where the light does not reach, right? Like a story that is hopeful without melancholy, like sweet without like bitter, is it's just sugary. It's
Yeah.
just like it's like it's cotton candy. But a story that's misery without any joy or hope or love is trauma pornography.
Yeah.
Like there's no like you have to find the space for both to breathe.
Yeah. Speaking of like finding community in a time like this, when I was reading Uzaba's the Ashcan, I really resonated with Hey Kid. For people watching, Hey Kid, they are a resident of Uzaba's bed and breakfast. All the residents are amazing, I should say this, but they instantly stole my heart. As a queer, sort of neurodivergent person, they really resonated with me. In a separate interview, you talked about how kids can articulate things that adults always can't, and that they're able to spot what adults won't let themselves spot. You mentioned that there is a lack of intriguing children as characters. Was Hey Kid born as a wish to fulfill that gap? What inspired you to write this character?
Is almost like if the Jade Dragon oeuvre has like reoccurring characters, if it's got its commedia dell'arte cast, Hey Kid is an archetype that shows up a lot in my work.
Mm.
I think you see them as the ragamuffin in Wander
Hmm.
Home. You see them, I think, as the fresh blood in Sleepaway. You know, they show up as this child who is less experienced and less certain, and kind of on the precipice of becoming something more, and they carry this kind of hurt that they haven't really been able to conceptualize, because when you're a child and you've been hurt, you're not, like you don't that hurt does not linger. It's like a thing that you're kind of trying to reconcile with, but it's not present. And so Hey Kid is kind of part of that lineage of kids of neurodivergent, inattentive ADHD children, or hyperactive ADHD children, who are on the precipice of becoming older. And yeah, I love Hey Kid. Hey Kid's also my favorite. Um, they are they're the character that I feel like I established very early on. Like
Mm.
Gertrude and Hey Kid were some of the first fleshed out residents, and I really like kind of like was like this is the kid who I really care about developing the story of. And I love them also partially because one of the things that's like there's a lot about Uzabas which you can understand from the text. There's a lot of stuff which you only realize through play. And one of my
Mm.
favorite bits for Hey Kid is that as the chapters go on, there stop being as many chapters about them. There are very few late chapters about Hey Kid in comparison to other characters.
Right.
And the reason for that is because Hey Kid's journey is about growing up, and it's this kind of like Digimon style like stat system where like they
Right.
evolve in different ways based on how you care for your Hey Kid, which I adore. That was M's idea, and I adore it because you end up with like at the end of playing a bunch of chapters of Usaba's, your Hey Kid is different than someone else's Hey Kid,
Yeah.
right? Like the Hey Kid you make is a different kid. And so Hey Kid becomes a character who's not only like a very kind of important core to me. Like it's very important that the child has a voice. I think children like are a really important part of society. That like children and old folks are both kind of people who like certainly in my society get heavily like shoved aside and quieted and minimized. And Hey Kid was really important to kind of capture that sensation, but also the fact that they can grow in their own way, and that everyone who cares for them, you end up with a different Hey Kid over time.
Right. I think a lot of Indian kids who if they have the opportunity to play Zeba will find themselves in Hey Kid because of precisely that reason.
Hmm.
And I look forward to
One of
just
my
yeah.
one of my campers from summer camp
Right.
really bonded fast with Hey Kid, and their name is Lunchbox, which is a very Hey Kitty in name, and to this day, every once in a while, when I'm a little unsure about something that Hey Kid would do,
Yeah.
I message Lunchbox, and I'm like, "Hey, listen,
That's
I need your
amazing.
advice. How would Hey Kid decorate their room?" And then Lunchbox is like, "This is what Hey Kid would do." And I'm like, "Thank you."
That's amazing. Shout out to Lunchbox. Um, that's
Shout
great.
out to Lunchbox, MVP. Hmm.
Um, before I jump into the community questions, because people were really excited to ask certain things, I'm going to ask you one last question from my end,
Hmm.
which is you mentioned that you started working on Wander Home while working on Usabers. So, you've been with this
Mhm.
project for a long time, and now that it's finally on Indiegogo, you still have at least another year to go, right? So much of your
Don't
life.
rub it in.
I'm just saying, how do you sustainably stay with the project for so long? Because I'm sure like a lot of writer designers in the community might want to sort of like have your insight on that. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to rub it in. I was
Usaba's bed
just
and breakfast. No, no, you're so good. You're so good. Usaba's bed and breakfast is an endurance run. It's the most. It's the hardest and longest I have ever worked on a project. I used to be the kind of person who would make things and abandon them and make things and abandon them. And the critical thing I learned is that the last 20% of your writing work, first off, will take about 80% of the time, right? Like the time is not evenly distributed among the project. You're gonna spend a lot. Like we thought Yazeba's was pretty much done a full calendar year ago.
whoa.
It's not. It was not. It was not pretty much done a full calendar year ago.
Right.
It had a lot to go. Um, but um, it's a game where, like, I think that it's about pacing yourself. It is also about understanding that the part of, I think the other two critical things are the part of you that finishes projects
Hmm.
is a different muscle than the part of you that starts a project. And
Right.
we exercise our starting muscle a lot because we do it a lot. We start things often, but we don't really exercise our project completion muscle. It's much less utilized.
Right.
And so I think that we just don't have the experience with ending things in the same way that we have the experience with starting things. And I think my recommendation is, lots of small projects that give you space to end them
Hmm.
and like end them early just to get in the habit of ending things, get in the habit of drawing the conclusion point. And then also, finally, I would say that one of the important parts of Usave is, having co-writers, right, where it's like, hey, I'm stuck on this part. Can anyone else hop in and do it? Is huge. But also that, like, knowing when you're stuck on a project is really important because when you write a paragraph and you know there should be a second paragraph, but you can't write it, it means you can't be writing it right now. Because
Right.
writing something that you're forcing yourself to write is going to suck to read. No one's going to want to read it. So what I always do is when I get stuck on something, I just do some bullet points. I move on to something else that I do want to write. I try to always kind of let myself hop around. I kind of
Hmm.
indulge in my neurodivergence, which is that I'm ADHD, so I love to just hop around from thing to thing, and I'm OCD, which means that I'll make very complex, ornate spreadsheets around something, and so I'll do both of those, and that's kind of that all counts. And just knowing when to be like, this paragraph's not finishing. This part's done. Like, if there was another paragraph I wanted to write, if I can't get myself to write it, if I can't be bothered, clearly it's not that important. Otherwise, I'll come back to it later. And just
Right.
being able to hop around, being able to call it quits, those are all kind of the muscles you have to develop, I think, as you go, as you become as you go from like a beginner intermediate creator into a more advanced creator, right?
Right.
That's my perspective.
That's great. I think some creators, and I have this problem, struggle with the idea that art can not be finished. And you hear people say that art is only abandoned. And I feel like that, where do you fall on that? How do you know that this is complete and I need to let this go?
So I'm not really. I think Leonardo da Vinci, right, and like is kind of the classic. I used to study art history.
Hmm.
Leonardo da Vinci is the classic. Like I don't finish things. Like he
Hmm.
only made like 30 paintings in his life because he just doesn't finish things. He would just repaint the same canvas. Um, I don't feel that way. I really like finishing things
Right.
because, and it's just like, to me, it's not about abandoning. It's just like tying it together with a little
Yeah.
bow, like just kind of, and like if the version you make that you tie together with a little bow is incomplete, that's okay. It's still tied together. Like people won't mind if it's not the same thing in your head, right? If you make a like I wrote, there's at least a few zines of mine. I think the Flower Court, Kid Impossible, even
Hmm.
like Wander Home to a degree. Like in my head, I was like, I'm gonna do 20 playbooks for Wander Home, and I wrote 13 of them, and I went, I only have two good ideas left. I'm not, and like I think that if I in my head I was like, Wander Home has to have 20 playbooks or else it's not done. If I
Right.
had that mindset, the game would never be done. So I just had to be like, well, and that's not abandonment. That's acknowledging your limitations. And I think that's really important that, because all sorts of reflection on your part of yourself, right? Like, there is only so many good ideas you have. If you have 5 good ideas later, that's an expansion. That's a second edition. That's a reprint, right? You can always come back to a project and you can expand it and you can edit it, but you gotta know that, like, there has to be iteration. You have to be able to say, like, this is the project as it stands at this point in time. And if I truly have the energy and capacity to add more to it, I can always do that later. But right now, this is where it sits. And that you just have to be willing to tie the bow on it, willing to kind of pack it up in that moment, even if it's. And, like, I've been trying to put more incomplete stuff online, almost to set an example of that. Like, In the Time of Monsters is a game I put up that has no layout, has no art, is missing half the rules. And I'm just like, nah, this is your problem, right? Like, I
Right.
wrote as much of the game as I felt like I could. And then I wrote a little bit more, and I was like, and we're good. I finished it, And it was just like, could I write another 100? Like, could there be another 200 or 300 pages to Time of Monsters? Yes. Am I going to write it? Not right now. Someone else might. Maybe I will in the future. But
Mm.
as it stands now, it is good as something that is incomplete.
I respect that, and I think there's a lot to learn from that. But community questions, because they will
Community
not be
questions.
happy with me if I don't get these in. So, first up
Yes, let's
is
answer some questions.
how do you start something as collaborative and huge as Uzaba's Bed and Breakfast? It feels like a shift from working
Um.
solo on a project.
Oh yeah. I mean, you can't start something and, like, from the beginning be like, this is gonna be giant. You got to start something with the thought that it's gonna be kind of small. You got to lie to yourself effectively. And then let it snowball. But when you start something thinking it's going to be very big, you're going to get tired before you even reach, like, the quarterway
Right.
point. Part of the way Eusebius was very big was we started with, like, literally just kind of some notes on the page, and we started developing a little system, and then we were like, oh, well, if we want to do this part, we should probably do these other things too. And then we were like, oh, well, if we're doing these things, we should bring on these other writers. We should
Mm.
bring on these other, we need artists for this, right? Like, it you learn what you need as you work on it. You can't from the onset sit down with 8 people and be like, let's make something huge, because unless like this is everyone's job and they're being paid by Wizards of the Coast to make a new big thing, they're not gonna want, like, dude, that's not a sustainable approach. You
Mm.
have to think about it like you like because if it's a community work, you have to think about what it means to build a little community, right? The team is a little community. So
Yeah.
uh, don't start building Uzabas. Start by writing a 1-page game, and then realize, like, Wanderhome was supposed to be a 2-page game, but I wrote 2 pages of Wanderhome, and then I went, oh, but I can add a playbook to this, and I wrote the playbook, and I was like, oh, well, the playbook needs places to go, so I should write a few place natures, and then, like, the whole system expanded outward.
Right.
It spiraled outward because it all self-justified. And if at any point, like, I could have. There's a version of Wanderhome without any of what it is.
Right. That's
And
amazing.
I could have written that instead. But it self justified its need for all these other things. You have to listen to it.
Right. What were the biggest challenges in creating Uzaba's Bed and Breakfast?
Its endurance, its length,
Right.
keeping myself paced, its size. It's properly a project for a team twice as big and like half as disabled. Um, Yeah, it's a big. It's just a lot of work. Like, it is just simply an endurance test,
Right.
and it is hard to pass an endurance test. I am not. It's just a lot. It's not so much the work is hard. It's just, like, the work is methodical and the work is thorough. And at the end of it all, you want to make something that's not typo filled. You want to make something that's solid and cohesive. And so building the philosophy, building the structure kind of just over time in this plotting way, and just knowing that sometimes you're gonna make a decision which you're gonna have to read. Like, I regularly come back to parts of Yusebas that I wrote 2 full years ago and have to, like, rethink and think about it and be like, what was I thinking 2 years ago when I wrote this?
Right.
And that is just a different relationship with something like Wanderhome, right? Where if I'm doing that with Wanderhome, it's because I'm coming back to the finished version of Wanderhome.
It's amazing. Um, how did the decision to have a few main characters distinct from other guests come about? Like the residents, I mean.
So we started with, so pretty much from the onset, Uzaba's was focused on preset characters.
Hmm.
Um, we realized somewhat early on, pretty quickly, that like there's some guests who are more interesting than others. Some guests who we felt we could tell a full story with,
Right.
um, whereas other guests felt much more limited. Um, and so those guests we promoted to residents,
Right.
where it was like we basically realized we were like we always want the chapter to have Gertrude in it, right? Like most chapters we write have Gertrude in it. We're not gonna be writing like we're not gonna be writing that many chapters about Rag and Bones, right? Like we love Rag and Bones, but that nasty skeleton is not gonna be like a constant main character. And so we realized that that division existed, and we marked it out and we separated it.
Hmm.
And it's it's just been kind of a presence ever since. The call we made in the first like couple of months of design, and it just stuck.
Right. And before I let you go, you've made a lot of games about journeys that change us and the intimacies of home. What are themes you hope to explore in your future games? And honestly, if this is not a question you want to answer right now, you can tell me and I will be like, you know what? That's respectable.
Oh no, it's a tough question to answer because Yoseba's in a lot of ways is the end of a chapter of my life.
Mm.
I've been working on it for a long time, and a lot of stuff in my life is changing as Yoseba's ends. So it feels very much like a tumultuous period where like I am changing as a person somewhat fundamentally through the release of this game.
Yeah.
So I am not sure what I think I anticipate. I've been, the things that I've been writing. I'm looking at them. Um, I think there'll probably be some dark stuff. I want to go back a little to my darker roots. I've got a sketch for a second edition for Sleepaway that's very sketchy right now, but it does give me a sense of like where I want to be going. I think I'm really interested right now in the kind of mundane tragedy that is kind of existence that kind of existing under capitalism of like I wrote a short story about someone who has this like supernatural problem but they can't really explain it to their therapist and it
Mm.
feels very kind of like poignant and so I think I'm very interested right now in and also I'm Ray Najati and I are working on a game that's very much a very like I don't know, I think I'm interested in
Our
like
Haunt? Is that the one?
I'm finding myself like our haunt was just right. We're working on a
Ah,
game together that we haven't announced yet, so I'm being a little coy.
I see.
It's Forged in the Dark, so it's not
Ah.
really anything else I've done before. Um, but I actually didn't know how to play Forged in the Dark, and then we started working on it, so I've been having to learn the systems as we work on it. But um, that game is very much about like dreams and like the desire to be more than who you are,
Right.
and like masks and like uh, kind of the separation between the mundane and the magical. So I think a lot of the same stuff I've always been doing. I think probably expect maybe a bit more darkness coming back. Maybe probably a lot of quiet stuff. And then yeah, I think maybe a bit more magic too. I think I've missed kind of the explicitly magical, but we'll see what comes up. I think that there's there's a lot of ideas. I like to joke. My brain. I'm an extremophile. Like my brain is very hostile to new ideas. That like every single idea that goes onto the conveyor belt gets like stress test for 1,000 different things before it makes it to the part of my brain that actually writes stuff. So I've got a lot of ideas in my brain. About one of 1,000 will make it into print. So
Amazing.
we'll see what happens.
Right. Well, thank you so much for answering my questions and the community's questions. I hope you had a good time. Um, but
Yeah,
before we
thank you so
end,
much.
is there anything you want to shout out? Anything that comes to mind? A particular Indiegogo, perhaps?
Please go back. You say it's been referenced on Indiegogo. We're we are rushing towards our funding goals. It's a wonderful game. I'd really love to do the Hate Grant. It's a really beautiful project. We've put our hearts and souls into it, and I really want to see it make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So please go check that out. There are also a lot of cheap tiers. If you are if print on demand drive through RPG, like that's a physical version of the book that you can get for like including shipping like 25 USD, which is like much more affordable than a giant book. Like it's a pretty affordable version of the book. The digital version is also very, kind of there's a lot of great options, kind of regardless of where you are financially. We want to be able to support everyone. So please do go check that out. Please support us. It would mean a lot. Thank you.
Where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me on the internet. I am on Twitter. I am at Jade Dragsky. I am the most notable Jade Dragon on Twitter. So, you'll find me. I trust. You can also find Possum Creek at Possum_Creek on Twitter and TikTok. We also have a Discord, the Creekside. We have two Discords, the Possum Creek Campsite, and we have a Patreon that has a special Discord. That's the Creekside Community Center. So come for the campsite, stay for the community center. Come hang out with us. I am often in calls there, answering questions about stuff, hanging out, giving design advice for free. So come say hi.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching today's episode of Cast Friendship. I hope you had a great time. If you liked the interview and you like what we do here, consider following or subscribing or any of those things where you interact with us and make us feel loved. Thank you so much.